When Charlemagne died, he was followed by a series of weak kings, and also the French had the habit of, when the king died, the king would divide his kingdom among all of his sons, with the result that the kingdoms became splintered. So Charlemagne's big kingdom, he only had one son, so his son Louis got the throne. Louis was a weak king, but when Louis died, Louis had 3 sons, so the empire was divided into 3 sons, and each of them had more than one son apiece, and after a while, it became so fragmented. Eventually, Europeans learned the practice of primogeniture, only give the oldest the estate. But Europe went through a second, you might say, second dark age after Charlemagne died. And the result was a system called feudalism. Feudal. Now, we've talked about feudalism in connection with India and with Japan, but in Europe it was most pronounced. Nobody planned it. Essentially, feudalism was where, well, before Charlemagne died, the Vikings came in. So the Vikings came from Scandinavia. Scandinavia is the far north. Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark makes up Scandinavia. And if you think the word Scandinavia looks like scandal, there's a reason for that. Those people, sometimes their conduct was considered scandalous by the rest of Europe. But I'll leave that topic for the moment. But anyway, the Vikings came in from Scandinavia, and they wreaked havoc with Europe. In fact, there was a prayer that the Europeans would recite, and it was still in the prayer books as late as 1800. From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us. And nobody seemingly could handle these Vikings, and they came in. In addition, the Magyars, another group from Central Asia, came in. The Vikings, the Magyars, they created havoc in Eastern Europe. And of course, from Spain, through Spain, there was the Muslims, known by several names. Moors, Saracens, Muslims, but they came in. Eventually, now I'm jumping ahead, so the Vikings were converted to Christianity. The Magyars were too. The Vikings settled down. The Magyars settled down. The Moors never converted. And anyway, that's another story in of itself. Now, as a result of all this chaos, a man would get together with a powerful man, and he would say, I can't defend my family. Will you please help me? So he would swear an oath of fealty, and oftentimes they'd do a ceremony called homage, where that the man who was becoming a vassal he would bow down, and he would put his hands together and cup his hands between the man who he is swearing all loyalty to. And he'd say, I will follow you to the ends of the earth. I'll help you fight your battles. And in turn, the Lord would say, and I will help you fight your battles also. And this was a rough and tumble system. Some men became more powerful than others. Eventually, the more powerful men became the dukes, roughly equivalent to the governor of a state. And then under the dukes were the counts. There were some places there were earls, viscounts, and barons. These were ranks of nobility. I remember when I was in high school, one of my brothers checked out a book on the Crusades. I'll never forget the first sentence. It said, if you had lived in Europe through the Middle Ages, you would probably have been someone's vassal. Everyone in Europe was a vassal. The Pope was a vassal to God. The king was vassal to the Pope. The dukes were vassals of the king. The counts were vassals of the dukes. The barons were vassals to the counts, so on and so forth. And then the serfs, of course, were vassals to all of them. Everyone was somebody's vassal. At the very bottom were the serfs. They were not nobles. We'll talk more about them later. But this was a lot of the social structure that came out of it. This, again, the nobles eventually brought some order to Europe, and some of Europe's kings eventually made the agreements with the Vikings that we'll let you have certain land. In the case of the French, the Vikings were given the land of Normandy, and Normandy is still in France. And Normandy makes news every June 6th because the United States got Normandy when it came time to land in World War II. It came time to cross the English Channel. The United States was destined to get Normandy. But the word Normandy means Northmen. A lot of Normans were given land in Italy also. And anyway, as a result, the Vikings who came from Scandinavia eventually settled down, and then they started helping their fellow Europeans fight off new Vikings, and the Vikings after a while quit invading. Because the Europeans, thanks in large part to help from the former Vikings, they were able to fight off, and basically Europe got to where it was ready for these people. So again, a lot of it was due to the influence of the nobility. Now, also, there came a new type of warrior on the scene called the knight. Now, this is one reason the story of Arthur is not believed, because they're saying that they're putting forth what's called an anachronism, that knights did not actually exist in 500 when Arthur would have lived. So that's an anachronism. An anachronism is like where you have picture George Washington galloping in the battle with a machine gun and driving the British back with a machine gun. Again, that's called anachronism. And I still use an anachronism myself when I say I'm taping the lesson. No, tape is not used anymore. Tape is obsolete. But that's called an anachronism. But anyway, the knight came on the scene around the year 1100 or so, 1000. To become a knight, you had to be of noble birth. Well, back up. The word knight means mounted horseman. But you had to be of noble birth. And when you were 6, you served as a page, usually a page to your father, who might be a lord, or a page to the king. When you were 14, you became a squire. I'm not going to write it down. At 14, you became, and there you learned how to hunt and handle weapons. And hunting, now this was a big issue. Only the nobles were allowed to hunt. Now, most of you might never go hunting, but hunting was considered a privilege for many, many generations of Americans. And that is why we allow anyone who can get a license to hunt, owing to the fact that in Europe most Americans are descended from someone who was not noble in Europe. So Americans developed a dislike for anything that stood for nobility. So anyway, only the nobles could hunt in Europe, but in our country we allow anyone to hunt. But the squires learned how to hunt when they were 14. And then at 20, he became a knight. After spending a long night of prayer and after practicing a lot with his weapons. Knights would engage in sham battles called tournaments. The idea of a tournament was you gallop full speed against another knight and you try to unseat him off his horse. So you have a spear and he has a spear, and you have your shield, he has a shield, and you clash your spear against his shield, and hopefully you hit him hard enough. Now, we have this scene reenacted, if it still goes on, called the Renaissance Festival. Does it still go on? Does anybody know? Yeah. It still goes on, where we have horsemen galloping each other, but those knights are padded, and there also is an act. The knight knows he's supposed to fall off his horse, so he's learned how to fall onto a padded area without hurting himself. But so it's more of a show. But we have horsemen galloping at each other. But the problem with the tournaments, a lot of men were crippled for life. And eventually kings learned that this destroyed their armies. So they had to more or less quit having the tournaments, or at least try to make them safer and safer. Now, the knights dominated the battlefield for 500 years, owing to the fact they had armor. And a man without armor did not stand much of a chance against an armored knight, especially if he was on a horse. Now, this was to change with the invention of gunpowder. Well, actually, it changed before gunpowder. During the 100 Years' War, which we'll talk about after a break, the English used against the French the longbow. The longbow was about 6 feet long, and it could penetrate a knight's shield and armor. They also used the crossbow. Now, the crossbow, you had to have a lever to get it cocked, and once it was cocked in place, you pulled the trigger just like a gun and aimed it. The crossbow would hit a person really, really hard. Now, how many of you know what I'm talking about? All right, several hands ago. Yeah, the crossbow. In fact, some popes actually tried to outlaw the crossbow. King Richard insisted, no, we're going to use them anyway, and he was killed himself by a crossbow. As Richard was dying, they brought the man and said, sir, here's the man who shot you. Richard, he was doing what he thought was right. Turn him loose. They turned him loose. I mean, it was an act of war, and this man was fighting a war. But anyway, the knight was to become obsolete when the crossbow, the longbow, and the cannon, also pike. When you got a bunch of pikemen lined up shoulder to shoulder, they eventually got to where they could take care of knights in armor. These men learned how to hit you with a pike hard enough to penetrate shield and armor. So, but for 500 years, knights dominated the battlefield from about 800 to 1300 CE. The knights needed the lords needed the knights. All right. Again, if you had your ranks, nobles, the nobles were destined to rule Europe for about 15 or so hundred years. World War I did a lot to destroy the prestige of nobles, particularly in places like Germany and Austria. Now, since Spain did not participate, the nobility still had a lot of power in Spain for a long time. But nobles were to continue to govern or rule a lot of Europe for hundreds of years. In England, they still have the nobility, but the nobility has no authority whatsoever. They still have a House of Lords, and the House of Lords meets and makes a fine art out of doing practically nothing, just like the Queen herself. But again, the English want it that way. So to get into the House of Lords, you have to be born in it. Now, at the very bottom was the serf. The difference between a serf and a slave, serfs could not be bought and sold. But the serf was bound to the soil. He did the work of farming. He raised the pigs, raised the chickens, and plowed the land. They were at the bottom, and for all practical purposes they were slaves, except that they could not be bought or sold. They could only get married with their lord's permission. If the Lord agreed, they could serve the church in a capacity of monk or whatever, but they were at the bottom. Serfdom was to remain a part of the European scene for more than 1,000 years. Now, when everywhere Napoleon conquered, he abolished serfdom. When he took over France, serfdom went out. Napoleon conquered Holland for a while, and serfdom went out there. Everywhere he went, serfdom ended. The last serfs in Europe were freed in 1862 while we were fighting our civil war to free the slaves. The Tsar of Russia, Tsar Alexander II, freed the last of the serfs in Europe. Again, the serf was at the very bottom of the society. Chivalry
Is dead.
is what? Is dead. Chivalry, it might be now. This was the code that the knight was expected to follow in his treatment of women. And I've compared it to the Japanese code of Bushido. But for instance, if you've read the story of Robin Hood, there was a big log that was used to cross a stream, and Robin Hood and Little John arrived at the log at the same time. Neither one of them and both of them refused to back up. Little John said, "I'm the better man." Robin Hood said, "I'm the better man." So they both went across the log at the same time. Little John knocked Robin Hood into the water. But Little John and Robin Hood became fast friends after that. But if Little John had been a woman, Robin Hood would have backed up and let the woman cross first. Again, this was chivalry. If Robin Hood had been a woman, well, Little John would have backed up and let the woman cross first. Again, this part of chivalry where you hold the door open for the women, help the women with their coats in the winter time or whatever, and where the men pays for the meal. Now, I want to give you something personally. In 1987, I had been working at Lockheed for 8 years. And I asked this girl to go with me to Stone Mountain, so she went, and she was unemployed at the time. She had no idea that to get into Stone Mountain, I had to pay a fee. Well, when it came to pay at the gate, I pulled out my wallet. In those days, we used paper money. We didn't have a card. Pulled out my wallet to pay, and she pulled out her pocketbook and said, I insisted, but I said, I knew this was going to cost money when I invited you in here, and I came prepared to pay. Oh, but I want to pay my part too.
You argued with her about paying?
She wanted to pay her half. Then when it came time to rent one of their paddle boats, this was, in 1987, I was caught unprepared. She insisted, even though she was unemployed, keep in mind, I'd been at Lockheed for 8 years. I'd had a bunch of money saved up. So I was doing pretty well financially. She was flat broke. I was willing to pay. Well, I went to Lockheed the next day and discussed with some of the men and women there, and one of the young single men said, yeah, some of my dates do me that way too, and I don't like it either.
Oh, you're so sweet.
Well, here's the thing about it. Let me tell you something. What this woman was sending to me was a message that, I'm not your woman and never will be. That's what I felt like anyway. I did not like it.
All right, maybe.
As far as I know, this woman never married. Again, I lost contact with her a year later, but I don't know whatever happened to her, but I lost contact with her. But anyway, there are some women who, if you hold the door for them, they'll get angry at you. I've experienced this myself. Yeah, there are some. Oh yes. Because they feel like that you're treating them like they're somehow inferior and they can't get by without you. All right, but leave that alone. We discussed this 55 years ago in high school. My teacher was Mrs. McLeod. She originally was Miss Frith, but she became Mrs. McLeod during that year. Is chivalry dead? And we would discuss that issue. And half the class thought it was dead and half the class didn't. But chivalry was the code of honor that the knights in armor went by during the Middle Ages. It was the ideal for the medieval knight. Now, women were mostly controlled by the men during the Middle Ages, but a lot of times their husbands were away at war. Europe fought war after war, mostly among themselves at first. But as European men went off to war, the woman was left in charge, and often, particularly like a count's wife or an earl's wife, was left to manage the servants and manage the estate, and even manage the few soldiers that the count might have left behind. She had to learn how to manage money, so a lot of women rose to prominence. The most prominent woman of the day was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor got to be a duchess because her father was a duke, and when her father died, Eleanor had no brothers at that time. If she had any, they'd all died. So Eleanor inherited her father's title of Duke, or her father's title, Duke of Aquitaine, so she became the Duchess of Aquitaine. Eleanor married the King of France, King Louis VII, and Louis VII was the second son of his father, Louis VI, but in the case of Louis VII, he'd been put in a monastery for many years. Then one day his older brother died, and Louis VI called and said, hey, son, come out of the monastery. You have to become heir apparent now. So he came out of the monastery. But he never got over the fact that he had once sworn an oath to of chastity. And Eleanor did not like this. So anyway, Louis VII went on a crusade, which he lost. And during that time he was on a crusade, he took 50 women with him, and all 50 of these women jumped around from man to man, including Eleanor herself. You're probably familiar with the story. Anyway, to make a long story short, Eleanor did not bear Louis VII any sons, but only daughters. Now today, folk, from what we know about, or what we believe we know about this issue, the man determines the sex of the offspring. So whose fault was it that Eleanor was not bearing male heirs? Well, it was the fault of Louis himself and not his wife. In those days, they blamed the woman for not bearing male children. In fact, a nobleman would oftentimes try to marry a woman who had a lot of brothers and no sisters, thinking that a woman who had a lot of brothers was more likely to produce a male heir. Today we know this is completely bogus. But this was so anyway, in the case of Eleanor, she had no brothers, therefore she could only produce female offspring. Now I just know the falsehood now. Because once Eleanor had divorced Henry VII, divorced Louis VII, she married Henry II of England, and she bore him 4 sons. Again, and as for Louis, he wound up having a child by another woman, a male heir by another woman, which we'll talk about later, named Philip Augustus.